Actually, we're a team effort here today. So can I invite my co-presenter?
We'd like to ask Kevin Satterley also to join.
University Counsel Attorney Satterley.
Vice President General.
There we go. Yeah. Some of you may or may not know that the university has been, well, the university actually can't be because they don't speak, but in our positions of responsibility, there's been a lawsuit brought against the university by a student organization and by the Center for a group of students and the Center for Law and Religious Freedom. Correct. And what they are looking for is to be able to be funded by ASBSU, and even though they claim discrimination, even though the Idaho Constitution says that you're supposed to do that, they're believing that it's a discriminatory policy and it's going to work. We've hired a litigator that Attorney Satterley's office works with on cases such as this. Their first thing they wanted to do was to put a freeze on all student fee money, all ASBSU funds, so that from this point until this case is settled, no money could be used and no budgets could be prepared for FY 10, which would be the next coming fiscal year, until this court case is settled. As a result of Attorney Satterley and Attorney Michael Moore, who is the litigator, meeting with them, they have come up with a compromise for us, which will mean that we need to put off the budget hearings that are scheduled to be, all the forms are scheduled to be in by tomorrow. I would actually advise you to continue to collect the forms. And then as we need to adjust some of our policy based on the fact that in this court case, even though it's a constitutional issue in Idaho, it has also come up in other states, and as a result of a Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court is looking at religious freedom or expression of religious identity as equivalent to free speech. So they're not looking at it as freedom of religion or religious organization, they're looking at it as free speech. And so it's given the right for these groups to come forward and get money from a student fee and get that on behalf of the free speech amendment. That they are not, the money will not be going to the whatever organized religious group that they are representing or any other sort of organization that oversees them. It goes to the students to allow the students the right to freely express their beliefs in their religion. And what the biggest thing that has come out of it, and it is it's words that you're going to have to get used to hearing, is that we have to prove that Boise State is viewpoint neutral. And I would write it all down because you're all going to be asked if in fact you are viewpoint neutral when you make any decision, and you will not take into account someone's religious background or anything when it comes time for their freedom of speech in order to fund that. So what has been negotiated is, you know, the dates of March.
But okay, then it's okay.
So Attorney Satterley will talk more about what the negotiations are, what we need to do between now and that time, and the fact that the present budget hearing plan is suspended until we can work on this and get it back to the courts.
Thank you, Mike.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, my name is Kevin Satterley, and I'm the university's general counsel. By way of short introduction, I'm also an alum of Boise State University, graduated in 1990, and take great pride in the fact that my name's on that plaque as you enter into the Senate chambers. So, a brief rundown. Dr. Liberty gave what I think is a good overall description of the situation the university finds itself in. Essentially, the university has been sued in federal court alleging that the mechanism by which ASBSU allocates money to student organizations is unconstitutional and violates the freedom of speech rights of some of the students at this university, or technically all of the students in one way or another. In sum, if I were to try to, in 5 minutes or less, explain the interplay between the First Amendment's freedom of speech rights with the Establishment Clause versus with the freedom of religion, I would fail any law school exam because it cannot be explained in 5 minutes or less. But in a nutshell, the best way to describe it is that when a university takes student fee money and allocates it to student organizations, it must do so in a manner that's viewpoint neutral. Boise State University has operated for several years under advice of several opinions of the Idaho Attorney General's office on how to handle that situation, and we have followed that advice. But a few recent decisions of the United States Supreme Court have slightly altered the analysis on how allocations of student fee money must be made. So we are going to enter into a mandatory system, a change in our student policies is going to be required. So myself, our outside counsel, and counsel for the other side will be working together over the next few weeks to create a new system that we will bring to you and ask for your approval. In doing that, in order to do that, we have to suspend the current budget process until the new policies are in place. So our hope is to have those new policies in place by mid-March-ish, so that then you can restart the process, have the student organizations bring you their budgets for approval, and then distribution of the funds. We'd like to do that right away so that all of the organizations have the ability to put in their budgets for this year, and you can fund them for next academic year. In a brief summary, that's where we are. I would be happy to take any questions or explain this in more detail, but I also don't want to take up all of your time, and be respectful of your time. But Mr. President, members of the Senate, that's what I have.
Are there any questions? Senator Henry? How does this affect our current budget, and is any monies frozen right now?
Mr. President, Senator Henry, no. It won't affect any of your current budget or your current funds. There is a motion currently in front of the court to freeze your current budget. But by making the commitment to redraft our policies and put in the new system prior to the next funding cycle, we have a tentative agreement with the other side to withdraw any claims to freeze current money or prior budget issues.
Any further questions? Senator Ingerson.
So is this, is it definitely going to change? Our policies are going to change so that we'll be able to fund religious groups now, or is that what's going to go to court, or are we just going to say, okay, fine?
Mr. President, Senator Ingerson, that is what we will change. And it isn't just with regard to religious groups, but it will be the ability to fund all organized student groups that meet your basic organization criteria, which right now does exclude religious groups, but they will be treated in the exact same manner as all other recognized and properly organized student groups.
If I may also add that the Supreme Court decision also looked at a number of other areas that we will need to be fixing as well, in terms of the ways in which we do business have not always based on this decision, are not up to date. And so rather than wait for perhaps another lawsuit, we'll be looking at creating and putting into place some more comprehensive and up-to-date policies and procedures.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, if I could just elaborate, we're not alone in this. Universities across the nation are all currently facing this. In fact, The most famous one at the moment is the University of Wisconsin system. They were the subject of one of the United States Supreme Court cases, is still involved in changing theirs. We've been in contact with the General Counsel's office at several universities, the California system, University of Washington, Washington State, and most recently, right now, the University of South Carolina is also rewriting their policies similarly. So we're, as a group across the nation, all universities are going through this, either because they are being sued or to do it in advance of getting sued. So it's not a Boise State issue, it's really a national issue.
Senator White?
Will students be involved in the remaking of those policy and
Yes, I can answer that. What will happen is we'll work with our general counsel office and outside counsel to make sure that we get really the bones and the structure of what needs to happen with regard to the legal pieces. And then we'll work in what we would see is what the students want and how they want to do it within these parameters. So as we start putting different things into place, there will be some things that we will have to do that will be mandated by changes in national policy. So that's going to be, but we're trying to not, certainly don't want to take the power away from the students in being able to make their own decisions. And just because a group, just as you do, as it's the same rule you have now, just because a group is able to ask for money does not guarantee that any group will get money. It all depends on how much money you have, on what your policies are. But as long as you remain viewpoint neutral and you are funding everyone by evaluating everyone equally, you don't have to fund everyone equally, but you evaluate everyone equally, then you'll be fine. But that all will come back. How it's done, there may be some forms that you have to sign, those sorts of things that we want to put in place now to prove that we are back on.
Are there any further questions for Senator Hanratty?
I guess just how soon of a timeline are we looking at? Like, is policies going to be implemented quick? Because I just know that these budget hearings, they take a lot of our time, and it's difficult for us to, I know Secretary Campa has been working really hard on getting these put together, and we've been trying to get our schedules worked around them. So I guess it's what's the timeline on getting this all ironed out?
Mr. President, Senator Henry, right now the goal that we're working for is to have these policies in place so that you can start your budget hearings by mid-March. So that really means that we need to have our first drafts of these policies done in probably 2 weeks to get to you for circulation and comment. For example, my office is going to present a set to you that we think meets all of the legal requirements, and then give it to you for your comment input. Give us time to get that in place, and then time for you to call for the student organizations to submit their budgets and then have the hearings. But our goal is definitely to get that done as early in the semester as possible so that it doesn't disrupt your schedule more than we already have to.
You may also, based on the fact that you have been collecting new budget requests and you have put out a message that tomorrow is the deadline, you can now have that be the deadline for groups that are eligible now. And if that, when that changes and if more groups become eligible, you can just have time for them to submit budgets. So you may not have to repeat the entire process because you already have some information. It would be, you don't want students to have to reproduce that and redo the same thing you've already done.
And Mr. President, members of the Senate, as long as we make clear that no group can suffer a penalty for not meeting a deadline of, if you, for example, there's nothing wrong with you saying a group can submit its budget tomorrow if they still want to, but a group that submitted it later can't have a penalty because we're going to have to extend those deadlines until the new policies.
Are there any further questions? If not, I'd like to thank Dr. McElwain for this talking to us today.
I'm available for questions if anybody wants to contact.
Okay.
And we've also, one of the things that we talked to General Counsel's office is to offer, especially for the Finance Committee, that we would do training around neutrality and being to ensure that, in fact, people understand what that means, and before they actually say we are doing it, they know what it is that you're asked to do. And that may not only be in place for this year, but that may be something that we put in place for every budget cycle. So that and then we could open it up to any question at all, but that would be mandatory to give you financial decisions.
So, Mary, did you have
Yeah, this is the first time I've ever heard the term viewpoint neutrality, but isn't this what we've been supposed to go by since the past anyways? Like when we look at budgets, aren't we supposed to be neutral on how we decide how much money to give people, like organizations, on their actions?
But based on the discrimination lawsuit, has been that the groups have been discriminated against because they've been not been looked at as neutral, not being looked at as the same as the other organizations. So that's where it's more of a legal term that we used, but the advisor will be used to seeing it, we'll be putting it in documents and saying we're going to clearly state that that's what our practice is. And in order for that to be our practice, we really have to understand what that means. And we, as the institution, will provide services to guarantee that you all get the training that you need so you're comfortable. Because you don't want a group turning around and saying, my group was treated differently by this person because they don't like you.
Mr. President, Senator Henry, for a legally, sort of the legal standard is a bit different, because historically student governments were viewed as funding their student groups as an extension of that student government operation. The United States Supreme Court changed that distinction, saying that those student groups are essentially student speech forms, that when student governments fund those student groups, you're funding a student speech form so they can speak on issues. And that technically changed the legal standard by which you judge their budgets from one that is, do they fulfill the governmental needs of the student body, to one that has a legal test called viewpoint neutrality when a governmental unit is funding a speech function. That's kind of a long-winded answer, but that's part of what the training will provide, is how a group has to look at funding requests differently when they're funding a speech form that is a protected speech form by the First Amendment.
Is that how they get around the whole separation of church and state?
Mr. President, Senator Henry, that's exactly how they are. The United States Supreme Court has, I don't want to get too long-winded here, has always said that there's a problem between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment. And things that look like establishment probably violate free exercise, and things that look like free exercise might violate establishment. And they've always had that problem. And for years had that problem until they brought into play one more clause of the First Amendment, and it's the freedom of speech clause, and essentially said that the exercise of religion, or speaking about religious issues, is not just the free exercise, but it's the use of the free speech rights as well. And thus, governmental money, like ASBSU money, can fund a group to speak freely about an issue that otherwise the government would be prohibited from funding directly in other forms. For example, ASBSU cannot, even if it really wanted to, and thought it was the greatest thing on earth, just to send checks to religious organizations as donations or otherwise, because then you are government funding of religion. However, ASBSU can, and in fact, in some cases may be required to, fund a student group, a group of its own students, who by their own choice choose to speak about religion. And that's the real fine line that the United States Supreme Court has laid down. And that's the fine line that separates a group of policies that are designed to look at student organizations as an extension of that governmental unit, the SBSU, versus looking at them as speech forms. So I'm sorry for that long-winded answer, but that's technically how the court drew that distinction.
Senator Ingerson, do you have another question?
Mr. Chairman, yes. So can we just change the definition of of the clubs that we fund, like instead of saying that we're funding you as a club, say that we're going to fund your projects that you do and like your extracurricular projects, and not necessarily say that those include speech and expression of your opinion?
Mr. President, Senator Hinkerson, no, not in that same way. What, if you fund any student activity that the courts would look at and say is a speech type function, then the courts say you have to put them all into the student speech forums and then fund them all viewpoint neutrally. And that's where the required test came down. The court essentially said, and this was in the, it doesn't matter which case, but what the court said was, if you don't do it that way, then the other alternative is to not fund any of that activity at all. The court has essentially said you have a choice as a student government. Either fund student clubs and activities and do it via this viewpoint neutral speech form analysis, or don't fund them at all. And you really only have those two choices.
Senator Reed, question.
Okay, I know, I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but, so you're saying that if we decide not to no longer do matching funds, because currently in our budget, the way it's written now, it's not sustainable in the next couple of years, and we decide that all student groups, if they want something, they just have to do, like, if they want a project or they want to send somebody to a conference or anything like that, then they file a request or a grant request, you know, to the Finance and Budget Committee here that we have. Are you saying that the religious groups get a free pass now because they're a religious group and we don't want, how does this work? Or is it they want to send one of their members to a conference, then they file a grant, or do we just have to fund everybody now?
They have the right to file like everyone else.
Okay, so we could essentially decide that from now on, people just file for grants.
Right.
Clubs and organizations file for grants to fund specific projects, and we could do that, and religious groups can file in that deal and be represented, but it's...
No matter what we're going to have to do is, no matter what the policy is, we have to include them in the policy. They have to be included equally as any other group. So if you decide to do away with matching funds for groups, that means every group. No one gets matching funds, which is fine if that's your choice. If you want to do it by project, if you want to do it however you want to do it, what we're going to get from legal counsel is what are those things that we have to have in place, and then part of it's going to be your input, and a lot of it will be probably through Joe, Trevor, and the finance group saying what are the pieces that we want to include in here, and what changes. Actually, it's a good time to make changes that we want, as long as we stay legal, and also update some of our policies that are now, we want to avoid lawsuits in the future as a result of the findings of these most recent lawsuits.
And one quick other question. How does that affect our power to authorize and deauthorize clubs as the ASBSU government?
Mr. President, Senator Reed, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
All right. Are there any further questions?
There are some issues around authorizing and deauthorizing that we have to look at, because there presently is not. I've spoken with the two executive members prior to this, is that presently isn't an appellate body that a group can go to if they are dissatisfied with the decision of being recognized or not being recognized. So there will be some changes in formats. That's what I mean by future lawsuits, because we've already been asked, what do we have in place if you have a group, you don't get recognized and you want to complain about it, you want it to be heard by someone else. We don't have there's not something in our system at the present time to do that.
So as long as there's a clear set of rules that all clubs know that they have to follow, so we could essentially deauthorize a religious group if they did not sufficiently meet the standards for being a club on campus.
Absolutely.
Like they don't have enough members, or if it's just one person, they decide to have their own thing, but they want $300 in matching funds, you don't get it because, I think that's the kind of thing. As long as we still have the ability to govern
absolutely.
matching funds and financing, that was my only concern.
The criteria for becoming a group does not have to be altered in terms of how you recognize, or what I would prefer rather than de-recognize is make it adaptive if they are in fact fall below what those standards are, or if there's misuse of funds or there are other things that happen, you do it like what you do for one, you do for all. is really what it's coming down to. So that's what we have to look at, how that plays out, that it's done in a timely manner, and it's all, some of it will actually be easier because we'll be able to just do standardized forms. You are no longer able to blank based on this, so hopefully it'll make your lives a little easier when you come down to some of these decisions.
All right. Is there anything else any of the senators would like to ask? Senator White, did you have something?
Kind of. Can I ask it? So I'm trying to understand it. So we might or not, or like students might lose the power to recognize and de-recognize as clubs. Is that
No.
what I got?
You'll be recognized. What you will need to do.
Kind of thing. So
No, what you'll have to do is there'll be a separate piece now that needs to be added to the recognition process. There'll be a recognition process, and if the people aren't satisfied with the recognition process, they have to be able to go to an appellate body to say, I want to appeal the decision of that. I want to appeal that decision. We don't have that in place right now. So according to this latest court case, we're vulnerable. It's not, we're against the law, we're just vulnerable for someone to bring that back to us. So we want to fix that while we're fixing this, to make it law. So we don't have to redo this every year.
Wait, because so is that going to mean we're going to have any changes to our constitution and our team papers? Because we'd like
This is
to
going to
change
be mostly
something.
on procedure and
Changes will be made in
policy.
financial code. None of it's done. in
Financial
constitution.
code is in your
Say, since
bylaws.
they're changing some of that, we can just throw some stuff in there.
Yeah.
Well,
Senator
some of it
Bingham.
needs to change. You can quote him on that.
Senator Bingham.
Just a quick question. When did the suit first come about, and is it just one religious group or a coalition of religious groups on campus?
Mr. President, members of the Senate, the lawsuit was filed, I think, on December 19th. We were served with it on December 26th.
It's a
the day after Christmas.
nice holiday.
It is not filed by an organized group. It is individuals who have sued the university in their individual name.
It's public information, and if you want to find it, it's Cordova versus Oliver.
Senator I, did you have a question?
I wonder what was the rationale behind not being able to support religious groups financially before. Why? Can you explain for me?
Mr. President, Senator, the Idaho Constitution, Article 9, Section 5, has an absolute prohibition from any public funds whatsoever being expended for the benefit of any religious organization. And following that particular case, which there are similar state constitutional provisions in several states, the university has not historically allowed religious student groups to seek funding. The distinction that this case brings up in the new Supreme Court cases is that the one that I explained earlier in the context of if a student government is funding a student club for its speech in a speech forum, then it is not funding a religious group. It is funding a student group's speech. And that is the distinction that the Supreme Court has now given.
Senator I, did you have a
I wonder, there are increasing population of international or various ethnic or religious background students came from all around the world to the Boise State University especially. I wonder what criteria they will use to recognize that the religion that we might never heard of. Or is there any preparation criteria you thought about that?
Mr. President, Senator, in the sense of funding a student speech group, that won't be relevant. Because what that group will have to meet to be organized is the standards you set for recognition of a student club, which will be without regard to, or viewpoint neutral, without regard to what viewpoint they're to express. That's the whole key to viewpoint neutrality. So the standards that you set for student club recognition will be the issue, not what topic it is they intend to speak on.
All right. We'd like to thank Dr. McLaughlin, Liberty, and
Kevin Statterly for coming in today.
thank you. Can I take another moment to address another issue?
Sure.
Two of our
Make it snappy.
regarding the area of student activities and the growth of the number of people who have been hired. It is not a growth that we are on. Believe me, I authorize every hire for the Division of Student Affairs. And if every single position has actually replaced another position, and if we were to go number for number 3 years ago when I got here, we're actually down 2 positions in this area. So the fact that you see some new faces is not the fact that we are spending a lot more money. We are not just hiring people. And with that being said, I'd also like to introduce the new Assistant Vice President of Student Leslie Webb.
Nice to
Leslie is one of those
see some-
positions. She actually, her position was 2 people's positions, so she's going to do the work for 2 people. It's highly capable of doing that, but it's actually where we have some funding savings. And she is presently located in this building, but will be moving into my suite of offices when I actually have a suite of offices. All right. I'm open for questions.
Dr. Liberty, while we have you here at this time, we're presenting a resolution to the Senate today that reinforces ASBSU Code 11700 that grants the power of appointment to non-ASBSU committees on the university to the president, with reviewed by the Senate. I was just wondering what the university position is on that concerning the student fee hearing board.
The Student Fee Hearing Board, there's a university policy in place on the number of students on that board, and the actual makeup of the board, as I have told President Greg, is really up to him on how we should do it. There needs to be a clear representation of some of the different student bodies that are looking as funding agents, in particular the undergraduate and graduate distinction, and also the fact that anyone who is a representative of that group must also be able to express neutrality when making decisions. So if there is somebody who is a member, for instance, when ASBSU's budget comes up for discussion, the president and vice president recuse themselves, as they always have, when it comes time for that vote. Yes.
The designation of deciding to set up representation between undergraduate and graduate students, was this decision recent?
This was, actually, I have the date right here. February 13th, 2008.
Okay.
University policy number 3150.
Are there particular student fees that will be looked at that affect graduate students in a different way than it would undergraduate students?
No, but they pay the same fees.
Might I ask them that we consider the representation of non-traditional students, international students, and all different other various student groups and bodies that represent the diversity of this campus to be on the board?
Are those groups actually slated as paying members within that differentiate from an undergraduate or graduate?
Well, we know that non-traditional students face different costs that are affected by the student fees than traditional
But
students.
is that something that when you look at the student fee schedule, are they identified as a separate constituent group that pays a different fee for their, or different fees for their services, for their education?
No. Do graduate students have that distinction?
Yes, they do.
Because they pay more for classes?
Yes, they do.
Is it a higher tuition rate or a higher student fee rate as well?
It's a higher tuition rate, they pay a full student fee rate.
But does the student fee hearing board have the ability to adjust tuition, or is it only look over student
It
fees?
hears the student, it hears about tuition, it hears the tuition increases and it has input on it, and also gives input to the president and vice president of ASBSU, who are members of the executive board, the executive budget board of the university, who do have that decision to make, who have that ability to make that decision. So that student contingency should also be advising the president and vice president on how to vote on those matters.
But in times past, in previous fee hearing boards, when one is discussed as far as raising rates and stuff like that, does it mainly go to the domain of student fees, like the activity fee and things like that, rather than discussing tuition?
This was, as I said, this was this new group, this new formation of the team was only a year old. It's only been through once. So at that time it was. So historically, my answer would be yes, because we only have 1 year old. But we've not had an executive budget team